In this trial, there will be no objections by counsel, only by the judge, if any, and I don't expect any. Clearly, there will not be any witnesses. The facts are stipulated to be true. Each of the lawyers will merely try and persuade you as to his or her position. Normally, the prosecution will speak twice because the prosecution has the burden of proof. But in this trial, we're taking a little liberty. Since we have such egotistical lawyers, they each have to speak twice. The reason, of course, being that the burden of proof is on the prosecution. That's why they normally will speak twice and the defense only once. Each lawyer will speak for 15 minutes and then a rebuttal for 10 each. I want to caution the lawyers that they can't exceed those time limits, but they certainly can speak a little bit shorter. For the prosecution, we have a young lady who is not only brilliant, courageous, eloquent, she's also good. It's Laurie Levenson of Loyola. Erwin Chermnsky was a professor of law at USC, my alma mater. He also decided to leave SC. I don't know why. But he went down to Duke and was professor of law there. But somehow he just had to come back to Southern California. He's now the new dean of the School of Law at Irvine. Now, one of the things I want you to pay attention to, since you are the jury, I'm going to instruct you in the law, all California law, by the way, because I don't know any other. California law, and I will instruct you ahead of the lawyers speaking so you can better follow what they say. A defendant in a criminal action is presumed to be innocent until the contrary is proved, and in case of a reasonable doubt whether his guilt is satisfactorily shown, he is entitled to a verdict of not guilty. This presumption places upon the people the burden of proving him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Reasonable doubt is defined as follows. It is not a mere possible doubt, because everything relating to human affairs is open to some possible or imaginary doubt. It is that state of the case which, after the entire comparison and consideration of all of the evidence, leaves the minds of the jurors in that condition that they cannot say they feel an abiding conviction of the truth of the charge. Homicide is the killing of one human being by another, either lawfully or unlawfully. Homicide includes murder, which is unlawful, and the acts of excusable and justifiable homicides, which are lawful. Malice may be either express or implied. Malice is expressed where there is a manifested intention unlawfully to kill a human being. Malice is implied when the killing resulted from an intentional act. The natural consequences of the act are dangerous to human life, and the act was deliberately performed with knowledge of the danger to and mental state of malice. Wait a minute, I made a mistake. Resulting from the intentional doing of an act with express or implied malice. I thought it was my mistake. I think it's the juror's instructions bad. But at any rate, When it is shown that a killing resulted from the intentional doing of an act with express or implied malice, no other mental state need be shown to establish the mental state of malice aforethought. The mental state constituting malice aforethought does not necessarily require any ill will or hatred of the person killed. The word aforethought does not imply deliberation or the lapse of considerable time. It only means that the required mental state must precede rather than follow the act. All murder which is perpetrated by any kind of willful, deliberate, and premeditated killing with express malice aforethought is murder in the first degree. The word willful as used in this instruction means intentional. The word deliberate means formed or arrived at or determined upon as a result of careful thought and weighing of considerations for and against the proposed course of action. The word premeditated means considerable beforehand. In your deliberations, do not discuss or consider the subject of penalty or punishment. That subject must not in any way affect your verdict. The defendant is not guilty of murder if he acted because of legal necessity. In order to establish this defense, the defendant must prove the following. 1, that he acted in an emergency to prevent a significant bodily harm or evil to himself or someone else. 2, he had no adequate legal alternative. 3, the defendant's acts did not create a greater danger than the one avoided. 4, when the defendant acted, he actually believed that the act was necessary to prevent the threatened harm or evil. And 5, a reasonable person would also have believed that the act was necessary under the circumstances. And 6, the defendant did not substantially contribute to the emergency. The defendant has the burden of proving this defense by a preponderance of the evidence. This is a different standard of proof than beyond a reasonable doubt. To meet the burden of proof by a preponderance of the evidence, the defendant must prove that it is more likely than not that each of the 6 items above are true. Ms. Levenson.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I never thought I would see the day when my friend, my colleague, Erwin Chermnsky, Dean Erwin Chermnsky, we would be catering to the right-wing religious zealots. But sadly, that is what's happening today. And instead of seeking peace and reconciliation, no, he defends this sexually repressed hothead who is charged with murder. Now, what had happened is that person, Pinchas, intentionally and with malice, picked up this very spear and rammed it through his defenseless victims, piercing their bodies where it hurts the most, and killing in the name of God. Ladies and gentlemen, that is what we call murder. And that is why we are here. Why did he do it? Because Pinchas wanted to be a big shot. He wanted to please his boss. He wanted to show off a little bit in the temple. But he ended up stabbing these 2 poor, defenseless people. Now, how do we know that these 2 victims were defenseless? For heaven's sake, they weren't even dressed at the time. They certainly weren't armed. Where do you think he could be hiding his spear? Now, I grant you, they might have been sort of, well, what's the legal term? Stooping in the corner. But last I looked, stooping is not a capital crime, contrary to what my mother thinks. In fact, Pinchas took the law in his own hands. He decided to be judge, jury, and executioner and snuff out their lives. Did he give them a chance to explain, but Pinchas, we are in love? No. Did he give him a chance to explain, but Pinchas, we are engaged? No. Did he give him a chance to say, but Pinchas, we just stood under the chuppah? No. He took the law into his own hands. He decided that they were diseased, kind of like we hear about mad cow disease, and he sought to wipe them out on the spot. But ladies and gentlemen, these were not cattle. These were people. People created in the image of God. And that is why we have laws against murder. We don't leave it to one man to decide what's best when it comes to life and death. We don't let zealots decide what's best for our society. Judge Wapner explained to you the requirements for murder. Let me show you why the prosecution has proved this beyond a reasonable doubt. The first requirement is that Pinchas caused their deaths. Shall I do it again? I think that's a no-brainer. The other issue is, did he intentionally cause their deaths with what we call malice of forethought? And the answer is, of course he did. He hunted them down. He caught them when they were most vulnerable, literally with their pants down. And he hit them when it hurts. And then he bragged about it and sought his bloody reward. He was so intent on bloodshed that he actually killed the wrong woman. And how do you know that? Because in the beginning of the Parsha, it talks about the whoring around of a Moabite women. Oops, this is a Midianite woman. So I asked you, does Professor Dean Chermnsky and his client think that, gee, all Moabites and Midianites look alike? Ladies and gentlemen, this was a setup. It was an Israelite who brought the woman over into the sight of Pinchas. Believe me, there were other places she would rather be, maybe a nice restaurant, a little hotel. But here she was set up because Pinchas, the religious zealot, wanted to make a point and use her as a sacrificial lamb. Now, we have degrees of murder. You've probably heard about it first or second. You can just check the box for guilty any way you want. But to say why this might be premeditated, it's the very nature of a zealot with a cause, that's thinking how he can best serve that cause. Does he go to the Sanhedrin and the courts and say, look at this couple, reach a judgment on this couple, look at their circumstances, and decide what their penalty to be? No, he sharpens the spear and just goes after them. And even if he didn't have an elaborate plan, we have the second-degree murder. Now, you might be wondering, what does this malice mean? Does it mean that, in fact, he had to dislike them or have a bad motive? And no, even if he didn't hate them, and I kind of think he did, motive is only a means to show that he did the killing. He could have had, and I need to impress on you this, the best motive in the world. But if it caused him to intentionally take their lives, that is still murder. Murder under the law. It simply means he thought about it ahead of time. You might be thinking, some of you, but what about heat of passion? We've been watching Law and Order, and we know about heat of passion. Well, you know what? Heat of passion killings are still manslaughter. They're still homicide. You still get to check that guilty verdict. And the irony here is, if you think about it, Pinchas arguing heat of passion, so he gets to kill in the name of his passion, and they don't get to shtup in the name of their passion. Before trying this case, I decided I'm going up in front of a pretty smart crowd. I better check with the experts. And so, not DNA experts, but there are plenty of experts out there. Every rabbi's an expert. As you've learned today, frankly, they didn't like what Pinchas did either. Now, it was a little hard to get them here for you today as witnesses, so I brought their depositions instead. The rabbis from the Talmud said, "It's a shanda, shame on Pinchas." The rabbi said, his ways were wrong. We don't praise the zealotry, and we must condemn the vigilantism. And the more modern rabbis would say, I'm frightened of my inner Pinchas. Anger and indignation are hard to channel. Once unleashed, plagues can follow. Not that you take care of plagues, but that plagues follow by the killing that you start. And that is from that holy book, the Jewish Journal. Now, my esteemed colleague, the wily and ever unpredictable Erwin Chermnsky, will speak to you next. And what do I think he will do? Hard to know, but I'm going to guess he's going to claim there's some type of defense. Well, if he tries to claim self-defense, don't forget that it was Pinchas who was the pursuer. He was the rodef. And it's also, where was the spear? If he tries to claim duress, who forced Pinchas to do this? Who told him to go kill these people instead of helping them in the error of their ways? Isn't it the role of the rabbis to say, look, let's help you reach tshuva, let's show you a better way, admit you've sinned? Or would you prefer that when you go to your rabbi and admit your fault, he'd just take out the spear and do you in? And finally, this idea of necessity. Gee, he had no choice. The future of the Jewish people was at stake. They're going to shtup themselves right out of existence. What has kept the Jewish people alive is not only shtupping. We don't let religious zealots take control. We are not part of that culture, and we know why. Because there are cultures that are driven by religious zealots that put their personal religious ideals ahead of the value of life, who think they're always right, whether it be Osama bin Laden, shamefully Baruch Goldstein, Yigal Amir, who killed Yitzhak Rabin, our friend Jerry Falwell, who advocated that it were gays who were killing off and disease our society. Here's one of my favorites, the Ayatollah, and then Columbia University's very own president of Iran. These are the religious zealots, and you'll have a choice. You can either vote with the law or vote with them. And it's not just them. It's our homebred zealots as well. On the screen are Eric Rudolph and James Kopp. Do you remember them? They were the ones who killed abortion doctors because they decided personally, their morality, that in order to save the world, save these unborn babies, they had the right to take human lives. They all have one thing in common. They kill shamefully in the name of God. They are religious fanatics. Believe me, if God wanted Pinchas to do this, he had a way of talking to people. He talked to Moses. He talked to Abraham. He talked to all of us at Sinai. And at no time before this dastardly deed does God say, you know what I want you to do? Take their lives. Afterwards, he says, what I want is a covenant of peace. I don't want zealotry. I want peace. To show that you are a people of the law, you must return a verdict of guilty. You must decide not to let his client and our society walk away with the message that taking human life is what God wants, that zealots know what God wants, and that the Jewish people, when we turn for answers, we turn to violence. Return a verdict of guilty. Thank you.
Mr. Chermnsky.
Careful, it's wet.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, in the Bible, this is a hero. He's credited with saving the Jewish people from extermination. So are we here today to celebrate Mr. Pinchas? To name a holiday after him? Pinchas Day? To name a building after him, a school, maybe Pinchas Tech? No. The state decides they want to prosecute him for 2 counts of murder. This is typical, overzealous prosecution. Remember, this is the same prosecutor who came to this court and tried to put Abraham on trial for attempted murder, the father of the Jews. Tried to put David, the king of the Jews, on trial for murder. Has she no shame? The problem with Professor Levenson's argument is it ignores the law and it ignores the facts. The Bible is clear. Pinchas' action was commanded by Moses. It was in the name of God, and it was the only way to save the Jewish people from extermination. I want to make 3 points for you this morning. The first is that under the law, in limited circumstances, killing is justified so as to protect people and others from even greater danger. Professor Levenson mentioned briefly the doctrine of necessity. Sometimes it's called the lesser of evils. We allow a person to commit a crime to prevent a greater harm. To find authority for this, I went to the Bible of Criminal Law, a book written by Laurie Levenson. Now, I assume she's going to deny having written it, but it's her picture on the back. And she writes, necessity. A person who commits a crime because the lesser of 2 evils can invoke the necessity defense. The necessity defense is also called the choice of lesser evils. Self-defense is actually a form of necessity because the defendant is allowed to commit a wrongful act in order to avoid an even greater wrong, death or injury. Modern law recognizes necessity for obvious reasons. Imagine it was a situation where a dam was about to burst, killing an entire town. Someone could divert the water, even though it would kill a few people, to save the larger number. That's what the idea of necessity is about. if you look at the Model Penal Code written by the American Law Institute, it tells us what's required in terms of necessity. Section 302 says, conduct that an actor believes to be necessary for harm or evil to himself or another is justifiable, provided that the harm or evil sought to be avoided by such conduct is greater than that sought to be prevented by the law defining the offense charged. It's quite similar to self-defense, as Professor Levenson recognizes. A person can take another life if it's the only way to protect oneself. There are other circumstances where the law recognizes the ability to take another life. There's the defense of duress. Again, what better authority than Professor Levenson? Professor Levenson tells us a key difference between duress and necessity lies in the rationale for each. Necessity justifies the defendant's actions because the defendant made the right choice given the choice of evils facing him. Duress excuses the defendant's behavior because the threats by another person deprive the defendant of a fair opportunity to exercise free will. The duress defense applies even if the defendant did not choose the lesser evil. If a defendant is excused from a crime because of duress, the person who forced the defendant to commit the crime is guilty of the offense the defendant committed. So what's required? Again, looking at the Model Penal Code, a threat of unlawful force against the defendant or any person of the type that would cause a person of reasonable firmness in the defendant's situation to yield. The defendant not recklessly put himself in the situation, and the defense is available for any crime, including homicide. Well, with this law in mind, I can go to my second point, that under the biblical passage, Pinchas' action was justified. Now, I do want to start by talking about the evidence. There's no eyewitnesses in this court. For that matter, there's no confession. Where is the DNA evidence? Now, Professor Levenson comes before you, and her exact words were, he killed with this very spear. And so I walked over to look at it, and do you know what her words to me were? It's still wet. I would be glad to rest this trial on that statement she made. This very spear. I'd be glad to rest this trial on my guess that this is paint and not blood. Shows you can't trust anything she says. What was striking to me about her wonderful presentation is how much it ignored the words of the Torah. Now, it's important to look at exactly those words, because after all, the only evidence she has is from this passage. And it says, the Lord said to Moses, take all the ringleaders and have them publicly impaled before the Lord, so the Lord's wrath may turn from Israel. So Moses said to Israel's official, each of you slay those of the men who attach themselves to Baal Peor. Now, there's a difference from all of the pictures she put on the screen. She tried to link Mr. Pinchas to all of those zealots. But in none of those instances was it God saying to Moses that individuals need to be slain. After it's reported in the Torah that Pinchas did kill the two individuals, it says, quote, then the plague against the Israelites was checked. Those who died of the plague numbered 24,000. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Pinchas, son of Eleazar of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the Israelites by displaying among them his passion for me, so that I did not wipe out the Israelite people in my passion. Now consider the law that I discussed a moment ago, the law that Judge Wapner instructed you on. Consider the defense of necessity. I took careful notes when Judge Wapner spoke, and he said that you, the jury, are to define necessity if 6 requirements are met. First, a person has to act in an emergency to prevent bodily harm to self or others. The passage tells you that God was prepared to wipe out the Jewish people if not for the act of Pinchas. Second, there have to be no alternatives. Now, Professor Levenson comes before you and says, there was an alternative. It was God who said to Moses, have your people slay those who are involved in this. What was the alternative that was left by God? What was the alternative left by Moses? Third, the individual has to be one who's not responsible for creating the danger. Of course, Mr. Pinchas had nothing to do with creating this danger. Fourth, the defendant had to reasonably believe that it was necessary to prevent the harm. Obviously, that's met. Fifth, the reasonable person under the circumstances would believe that it was necessary. If Moses came to you or me and said to do this, we would reasonably believe it was necessary. And sixth, that the defendant did not contribute to the emergency. Now, as Judge Wapner told you, all you need to do is believe this by a preponderance of the evidence. And I think that the evidence is clear in this regard. In fact, historians give us a reason to believe there was a necessity here. The Bible says 24,000 people died from the plague. Historians believe the bubonic plague was spreading at this time. That the Midianites thought that the way to protect themselves from this plague was engaging in sexual orgies. That the Jewish people joined in this. What the Jewish people didn't realize was that participating was spreading the plague among the Jews. What Pinchas did was stop the spread of the plague by his act of courage. Indeed, it was a form of self-defense, because had the Jewish people been wiped out, Pinchas and his family would have also been wiped out. It was self-defense. Well, what about duress? This, too, seems present here. Now, the key elements of duress are 3. First, an immediate threat of death or serious bodily injury. That was present under the words of the biblical passage. Second, a well-grounded fear that the threat will be carried out. God said so. Third, no reasonable opportunity to escape the threatened harm. That, too, was present here. And so, this isn't an isolated, random act of murder. It's not even an act of zealotry. It's an individual who took an action that saved the Jewish people from extermination, according to the words of the Bible. The third and final point that I want to make for you this morning is that God regarded Pinchas as a hero, and so must we. Continue with the biblical passage, the one Professor Levenson doesn't read to you from, and it says, and I'm quoting, "Say, therefore, I grant him my pact of friendship." This is referring to Pinchas. "It shall be for him and his descendants after him a pact of priesthood for all time, because he took impassioned action for his God, thus making expiation for the Israelites." The rabbis tell us that God knew the heart of Pinchas and knew that it was pure. The rabbis tell us that Pinchas' act was one that saved the Jewish people. And yet all of us are uncomfortable with the idea that Pinchas killed in the name of God. But if you think about it, what really makes us uncomfortable is the thought that our God would consider exterminating the Jewish people. I find the hardest thing at the Passover Seder is the thought that the God that I believe in would kill innocent firstborn children. And yet this is something that we have to reconcile with our views about God and religion. And so if we're concerned about what happens in this biblical passage, the concern really has to be directed at our thoughts about God and what God would order. Pinchas was just carrying out God's express will. All you need in order to acquit is reasonable doubt. And don't you at least have doubt about whether Pinchas did the right thing, given the words of the biblical passage? In light of that, there's only one way to vote when the ballots come around: not guilty.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Levenson.
Thank you, Your Honor. I want to see if he has the right edition here. The ink's still wet, as someone said. Okie doke. Well, let me respond to my esteemed colleague here. As I would say, nice try, but it ain't going to work. Let's start with his 3 points. Although, didn't you have the impression as he was going through 3 points that those were the 20 most 3 points you've ever heard? Let's start with this idea that Professor Levenson has written this book that says necessity is okay. Well, you know what? I know Laurie Levenson. Laurie Levenson is my friend. And I absolutely know what Laurie Levenson meant in that book. And in fact, necessity at common law, in California law, is not a defense to a homicide precisely because we can't decide whose lives are more valuable. You can't even decide it on the number of lives. Because if I were to ask you, what is more valuable? One Feinstein, or one Erwin Chermnsky, or one Joe Wapner, or one David Ben-Gurion, and I lined up all the felons you've ever known, would you be able to decide whose lives, how many lives, are more valuable? And that is precisely why the law has not allowed necessity traditionally to be used as a defense in homicide cases. So what does Dean Chermnsky do? He looks to what he wants the law to be, the law in what we call the model penal code. Well, you know why it's a model penal code? Because it's not the actual penal code. And therefore, I'm going to urge you to reject his argument. But let me just deal with some of these issues regarding necessity. He said that, what about the scenario where a dam was going to break and kill off the whole town? And you could save the town by just having it break and kill off one person. Well, that's not this. I don't know. Maybe Cosby, that's my victim, isn't it? Maybe she could shtup a lot. But I doubt she could have shtupped her way through the entire Jewish population to cause everybody to die. And there were already 24,000 people who allegedly had this disease. It seems to me that whatever remedy Pinchas thought he was choosing, realistically and practically, as required by the law, wasn't going to do it. Now, one of the things you heard is that there must be no other alternative to killing. It's pretty scary what my esteemed opponent is proposing. Have you ever heard people say, well, you know, there are these diseases out there, and they might infect society? They said that about diseases like AIDS when it came out. And what would the proposal be from this side of the table as to what we do with people who carry that disease in order to cleanse and save our society? When you hear those arguments, sadly, think about how they've been used against the Jews. They were used at the time of the Middle Ages, and they've been used tragically more recently as well. A good way to remember it is the religious right is usually religiously wrong. Now, moreover, about his argument, let's see what else he has. Duress. Well, oops, that too is not a defense to murder, and I don't remember Judge Wapner giving it as a jury instruction in this case at all. And I know Judge Wapner. He wouldn't forget anything that's important. What about this attack on the integrity of counsel and the evidence? That the wet stain on this could be from tampering. Has he ever considered, and don't make me use this, has he ever considered that when you take human life, the stain doesn't easily dry and go away. It stains you for generations to come. Now, every trial, I hear from him that somehow I'm prosecuting the wrong guy, and nonetheless people vote guilty on their verdicts. And then I hear, well, he's just taking orders from God, okay? And he says that even though every year he fails to show up with a witness. Where is God at the trial? God is in these words. And he went back to the text. But I'm going to go back one step better. Let's go to the Hebrew text, as opposed to that version of the English that we have here. In the Parsha, and feel free to translate for me. No. Vayomer Adonai el Moshe. Everybody's with me on that, right? Okay. Kach et kol Roshei Ha'am. Roshei Ha'am. What's Roshei Ha'am? The heads of the people. Last I looked at the language, it didn't talk about take all the Midianite women. It didn't take all the schlub Israelites who are attracted. It says take the heads of the people. But he is so eager, so desperate to come up with a defense for the slain that he would twist the words of Hashem to come up with the evidence. Now, what about this idea of a reward by God for Pinchas? Not a chance. It's not a reward for his extremism, but this was God's way of doing a little rehabilitation. By the way, Pinchas' name Phineas comes from where? From Egypt. He was Egyptian. That's not a lot to be proud of. Because they brought with them the violence that we have always been trying to escape. And so what does God do in God's infinite wisdom? He takes this man of violence, this zealot, who, even if he got lucky this time, cannot be countenanced because what the message would be to the remainder of the Jews. And he puts them where we think people, well, except for in Los Angeles, are safest, in the priesthood. And he draws him into the covenant, right? He says, Pinchas, you did the wrong thing. Let me help you redirect your life. Serve people instead of killing them. Find a lawful way, a legal way out of this dilemma. Don't be hypocrites. God did not consider Pinchas a hero. He basically has warned us of this. You have to stand up in your own community against religious zealots if you're going to do it internationally. Who are we to say to the world their religious zealots are wrong if we are going to let ours off the hook? Who are we to start playing God? A not guilty verdict in this case, and I don't want to put any pressure on you, is nothing less than a vote for jihad. All right? Too many people think they know what God wants. Pinchas killed because he could not control his rage. Maybe he had a need to be angry. Maybe he was impatient. But his victims, there's a reason they're described as being as vulnerable as they wanted. There is no self-defense here. They were not out polluting the entire community. They were two individuals who had never been judged by a court, nor even in this parsha by God, to be guilty of this crime. My esteemed colleague is amazing. And you know what? He can do amazing things with the concept of reasonable doubt. Frankly, after listening to Erwin Chermnsky, I often wonder if my name's Laurie Levenson, beyond a reasonable doubt. But you have an opportunity, and this isn't about voting whether you think Erwin's smarter or not, conceded. Whether he's a great dean, conceded. Whether he looks fabulous in that suit, conceded. This is really an issue, as it so often is in the trials we do, and the trials we have done together with Abraham and with King David and with others. The question of whether anybody is above the law. Nobody is above the law. And I don't care how big a celebrity you are. Please, don't let Pinchas join the ranks of Oive, Robert Blake, and that nice Jewish boy, Phil Spector. I implore you, be the one jury in Los Angeles that knows what it is doing. Vote guilty.
Finally, she said something I agree with. You should be the one jury in Los Angeles to do the right thing. I am not here today to defend jihad. She's attacking straw people. There's really two different ways of reading this Torah portion. One is that Pinchas was a crazed zealot, and I agree with her. We should not tolerate crazed zealots. The other is that in the words of the Torah portion, Pinchas saved the Jewish people. And if it's the latter, or you even have doubt about whether it's the latter, you have to vote not guilty. Now, I focus on two primary defenses. One is what's called the defense of necessity. And I rely on Laurie Levenson's book to tell us what the defense of necessity requires. She may try to get out of it, but remember whose picture is on the back of this book. I am not saying that Pinchas or anyone else is above the law. Necessity is part of the law. So what does she say? That necessity is not a defense to homicide. You listen to Judge Wapner's instructions. Nowhere did he say that necessity was not a defense to homicide. In fact, she may ridicule the model penal code, but it is regarded as a general, authoritative statement of law. It is regarded as the most current thinking, as promulgated by the American Law Institute. And on none other than page 319 of her book, she tells us that under the model penal code, necessity is a defense. Second, she says, this isn't the situation like the dam that was about to burst, where you had to divert the flow of the river to kill a few people to save a greater number. It's exactly that. Because again, go back to the words of the Torah portion. It says, and I quote, "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Pinchas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the Israelites by displaying among them his passion for me, so that I did not wipe out the Israelite people in my passion." We might be very uncomfortable with the idea of a God that considered wiping out the Israelite people. But this passage tells us it was Pinchas' action that saved the Jewish people. There's not been a clearer instance of necessity in all of human history. Next, Professor Levenson says to us, there has to be a showing that there was no other alternative. But what's the alternative that she gives to you? The passage says that God told Moses that those who were responsible should be killed. And Pinchas followed God's direct orders. And then, presenting another straw person, she says, think of what it would mean if we killed people because they had diseases. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is there was a plague spreading. The Parsha says 24,000 people died from that plague. What stopped the spread of that plague among the Jewish people? Pinchas' action. All of the elements for necessity are met. And I don't have to prove that to you beyond a reasonable doubt. So long as you think it's more likely than not there was necessity here, you must vote not guilty. I offer you a second defense, the defense of duress. And it is a well-established part of the criminal law, discussed in detail in the book Criminal Law. Professor Levenson wants to tell us that it's not a defense to homicide. Well, that may be what she wants to say today, but it's not what she wrote in her book. She says, for example, on page 346, the defense is available for any crime, including homicide. And so here, if you believe that there was a threat of death or grievous bodily injury that was imminently posed against the defendant or a close friend or relative, creating such fear that an ordinary person would yield, the defendant had put himself in that situation, then the defense of duress is available here. Then she says that I twisted the words of the biblical passage, that Pinchas was not rewarded, that in fact Pinchas was condemned. You can't reconcile that with the words that are in the Parsha. It says again